what we are talking about is platform envelopment with privacy policy tying. Okay, there's a lot of new terms here, so let me start describing. And I should say this is joint work with Jorge Padilla from Compass Lexicon. Okay, so let me start discussing very briefly platform envelopment, and let me read from the paper that defined it. A provider in one platform market can enter another platform market, combining its own functionality with the targets in a multi-platform bundle that leverages shared user relationship. So the idea is here to explain entry of a platform in another platform market through bundling. And the objective for the platform is to leverage the existing user base to avoid the usual barrier to entry that are created by typically network effect. And in a sense, this is a theory which is alternative. It is a theory of entry into platform market, which is alternative to Schumpeterian innovation. So the idea that entrant needs to create a radically different products in order to enter other platform market. And the authors argue, and I think they make a valid observation, that this entry in related markets by dominant platforms have shaped the platform ecosystem very much. Okay, so, and there are a number of famous cases, and I won't go in details on them. So let me just discuss instead the central theme of our paper, which is privacy policy tying. And so you could see platform as, in particular, we focus on what we call advertising platform that, that essentially work as attention brokers. So they buy attention from consumer in exchange for providing them with information or with services, for example, here search or mail, and resell this attention to advertisers who are interested in reaching out to these consumers. Now, what goes on is that often we see platforms that operate in different markets exchanging data among themselves. So how this is done? This is done by essentially, I wouldn't say coercing, but I don't want to say that, but so offering, conditioning the offer of the main service to the consent of the customer to allow pooling of their data across all sources that of data that the platform can in fact manage to collect. So you should know that when you do a single search in Gmail, in Google, for instance, you allow Google to collect all sorts of data about you and even build a profile of you. So this privacy policy tying is something that will happen on the demand side of this, sorry, on the supply side of this, on the consumer side of this advertising platform, but we will have an effect downstream. Okay, so let me go to our theory. So we are proposing here a story essentially on how the use of data can, so this combination of data can lead to market foreclosure. And so there are basically two key hypotheses here. One, that there is a dominant firm in a primary market, and the other is that data that can be collected in this target market have a value in the primary market, perhaps because they help monetization. In fact, more generally, we are speaking about economies of scope. So, okay, let me go in a bit more details. So here we have a dominant platform which is in a primary market, and there is an incumbent platform in a data-rich target market. And you may think, for instance, of Google and Fitbit, or I don't know, even Facebook and Tinder. And the data that comes from the target market increases the value of the services provided in the primary market. And this is the famous idea that data have economies of scope. okay, that generate economies of scope, which is at the center of a number of policy reports recently, including the CMA one. Now, what happens here is that the dominant firm can preemptively enter this target market and predate. So by means of predatory pricing, it's not really pricing here because prices are zero, but by offering services for free, for instance, it conquers the market, which allows this platform to harvest data that can be exploited to raise advertising revenues. Now, the data advantage then will protect the platform from expansion of otherwise more efficient target market incumbent in the primary market. And so here the key the key strategic incentive is that the developer is prepared to invest into conquering the target market, because if it fails to enter, it might trigger entry into its own primary market and therefore lose monopoly profits. On the other hand, the incumbent, if it manages to enter in the second period, will only face competition. Okay, so the opportunity cost, what they are losing from losing the target market, is much bigger from the dominant platform, much bigger for the dominant platform that loses monopoly profit. And this is basically what motivates the dominant platform to perform this entry. Okay, so can I ask you how much time do I have left? Because I've lost track of time because I cannot. All right, so let me go a bit more on the technical side. And so for people who are interested in it, essentially we look at two-stage entry game. In the first period, there's this incumbent that has a first mover advantage and decides whether to enter or stay out of the target market. Now, what happens if he stays out of the target markets? Then this entrant will enter in the next round the primary market. And here, VP is the essentially monopoly profit that can be attained in the primary market, and VT is the monopoly profit that can be attained in the other market. Delta is the data advantage, and X is the efficiency advantage of the entrant in the primary market. And F of P and F of T will denote fixed cost. And everything is really basic here. So you first solve this side of the game and show essentially that if the entrant stays out, so it is about identifying what condition on the parameter or what condition on the value of this data advantage generates this outcome which is negative for consumers. So if the entrant stays out, if the primary platform stays out, then the entrant will enter the primary market. Therefore, we need to think about condition on whether it is in fact convenient for the dominant platform to enter. And what it can be easily seen is that it is only, since it must sustain some fixed cost, this can be only convenient if it manages to win the target market upon entrance. And now, whether it manages or not to win the target market depends, in fact, as we were saying, on how profit will change for this firm. And the key point, as I was saying, is that this dominant firm M has a bigger incentive to enter because it can then avoid losing monopoly profit. While on the other hand, once M entering for the other firm in the primary market would only lead to competitive profit since M is already in. So this is more or less how the theory goes. So then, so this is essentially a story that we produced that might explain some of the behavior we observe in this market, and we go on discussing a number of potential remedies. Of course, now we are moving away from what the model was meant for, which was explaining that story, so that Of course, these policy implications are less robust, I would say, than our main conclusion. And we analyze a number of policies. One could be entry restriction, so a sort of an asymmetric regulation that targets the dominant platform and avoids entry in specific market, like it would avoid mergers, for instance. Another would be prohibition to data tying. So this idea that it's not possible to combine data across services. Of course, this would generate a loss in terms of efficiency because the data advantages now cannot be exploited by any firm. And then we discuss cases in which firm to allow data sharing between firms or data portability for consumers. And what we see with entry restriction is that they clearly stop whenever if the entry restriction is well targeted, then it stops the entrant from entering the primary market. It doesn't stop. It stops the dominant platform, but it doesn't stop the other firm, and therefore consumers are better off in this case. Now, prohibition with data tying is going to be less obvious because now you might still observe entry of the new entrant into the primary market, but this is not necessarily the case. So what happened with data sharing is that we identify instead some sort of hold-up situation. So suppose you allow data sales between firms. Now, what happens is that the primary market enveloper, now the dominant firm, instead of entering, can just buy the data for the other firm and compensate it enough for not entering into the primary market. Now consumers are worse off twice because there's not even entry in the target market, so both firms remain monopolists in their original market here. And the same problem can arise with data portability, because if consumer cannot commit not to share data and give the data away to each other firm, and they cannot ask money in exchange, this is again an assumption, of course, then it might be that you end up with two monopolies, because the new entrant now has not an interest anymore in entering, in some cases, into the primary market, because he knows he will lose the data advantage that is gained in the other market. So there are some potential risk of consumer being held up if they are given the power to transfer their own data to firms, unless payments are prescribed. Okay, so let me conclude then with giving you the essentially the main messages here. Okay, so this is a story, and in a sense this is a story which is very similar to Carton and Waldman's story. Here what is being bundled, so again it is basically a dominant firm that engages in some practice that reduces the profit from entry of potential competitors. So it is a Carton and Waldman story, but there is no, this does not occur through bundling of products, so to denying scale to the competitor, but it rather occur by economies of scope from entering one market or another market, which happens to materialize through data. And I presented an example with Bertrand competition, but the main message here is quite robust. So as long as there are these economies of scope across markets, and there is a dominant platform with first mover advantage, then this potential foreclosure, it tends to stay there. And I want to add that this is not just about data, it talks also to economies of scope, for instance. In general, this is about economies of scope of expanding in different markets, so it might also be a theory of ecosystems in some way. So the more you move into enlarging your ecosystem, the more you create an advantage that becomes difficult to overcome. And we can think of a number of, in fact, sort of entry of the source, some successful, some less. And in terms of what this theory speaks to, I would say we have a way also of talking about this data-driven acquisition and these big tech mergers, because sometimes, in fact, what we don't observe, it might be that this acquisition happen under the threat of a potential entry and predation in case the target doesn't consent to the acquisition itself. And finally, we discuss potential remedies. And I think what we identify as probably the more natural possibility are these two, either restriction on the dominant platform, so an asymmetric sort of policy that preserves the data economies of scope, or some more symmetric regulation like unbundling of data that, however, will reduce the potential efficiency from data bundling.
Thanks, Wynne. Thank you very much. And thank you to the organisers for inviting me, and thanks for your attention. A few comments. I think when I joined the Information Commissioner's Office from the private sector 18 months ago, the worlds of competition and privacy were ships that passed in the night, and it's been striking how rapidly the intersection between privacy and competition has been recognized, engaged, explored. And I've got to say, my thinking on this continues to evolve, and I used to describe this as a perimeter issue. I used to talk about how in the very old days as a privacy regulator, we didn't have much interaction with many other regulators because we didn't have much of a perimeter. And then as the GDPR came into play, and as data permeated everything that we did in our business lives and our personal lives, we developed more in the way of perimeters. I'm not sure now that perimeter is the right way to describe this. I think we're talking about, over some period of time, something closer to convergence and convergence of the digital landscape, and recognizing that data is not just a trail we leave behind us now. It's the medium through which we are all living our lives. Even the more so during this pandemic, when we are, even today, engaging virtually. And there's been a number of actions to recognise this in the regulatory sphere, and so I'll call out the obvious recent UK developments. The CMA's market study on digital platforms is an excellent piece of work, and I think the collaboration and information exchange between the Information Commissioner's Office and the CMA on that has been unparalleled and has been immensely rewarding intellectually as well. During those announcements around the launch of the market study, some would have noticed that the ICO and also Ofcom, the communications regulator, will both be involved in the CMA's digital task force, looking at the firm recommendations and where we go next with regulation in this sphere. And also that we now have what we call the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, which is a group consisting of the CMA, Ofcom and the ICO, which is sharing information, insight and resources to address this new digital regulation landscape. So that's all good, but I would stress that we have a long way to go, and we have a lot to learn from one another, from these different communities. The ICO and the privacy community think in terms of rights and obligations, and are far less focused normally on the economics of a situation. And this is something I really experienced when I first started working with the CMA. I think personally it was a really great relationship from the start. There was a lot of great discussion and a lot of willingness to share ideas, but we spoke different languages and thought in different concepts. And privacy and data protection is rooted as much in human rights as it is in the kind of concepts which tend to run through competition regulation. That all said, I do think there are a range of other areas that we can push on with this. I think the notion of privacy policy tying being a feature in this data dominance by digital platforms is something I think is very interesting and something which I think makes perfect sense. I do think there is a structural feature, and I don't know whether it's a bug or a feature, but it's there within the GDPR, which exacerbates this. So if you look at European privacy regulation and the GDPR, there we talk about data controllers and data processors. And this is not a new concept. This was also in the Data Protection Directive of 1995. And that really does place the obligation on the individual entity that determines the purposes and means of the processing, and the buck stops there. And whilst there are many obligations on that data controller, it is a lighter touch to shift data within that data controller, I'd argue, than it is to share data with third parties. And so you have, if you visualize the data controller as being an amoeba cell, then it's easier to shift data within that cell than it is to break through the cell wall and share it with a third party. And as such, this notion of privacy policy tying and the ability to share data within the organization is harder than to share it with third parties. And that's led on to different initiatives and different observations in different industries. I'm involved in the Open Banking Initiative, for instance, which I think is a great way of trying to share data within the financial services sphere. So I think that is part of this phenomenon of privacy policy tying, is this notion that whilst there are still some limitations on the entity, the data controller, around how they share data internally, there's concepts of purpose limitation within GDPR, for instance. It is still nonetheless easier to share data within an entity than to share it with a third party. So that I think is supportive of this notion of privacy policy tying. I do think there is more we can look at here, though. There are other rights and obligations in the data protection world which will affect these dynamics. And right now, I think these are relatively unexplored because the two communities, privacy and competition, are still getting to know one another. But whilst there's a natural focus on data portability, and that's I think the right place to go first, I would encourage people smarter than me on this call, who are steeped in the competition world, to also have a look at the right to be forgotten in the GDPR, the ability of individuals to effectively have their data deleted by entities, and how that may affect the dynamics. The various rights around automated decision making. So if we're looking at how entities are using swathes of data to exercise dominance, the ability of people to ask questions around how their data is being used in an automated way is also relevant. And finally, the emerging and very interesting area of privacy enhancing technologies. So how different types of insights around large amounts of data can be shared with different parties without disclosing the underlying data through homomorphic encryption, secure multi-party computing, federated learning, those kind of technologies, because they strike me as very interesting approaches to enabling different organizations to get value from the data and maybe to level up some of these playing fields without having to have all of the data shared with all of the parties. So maybe squaring this circle between privacy being something which is used as a reason not to share data with the desire to share data for competition purposes. One other point I would make, though, I think it's important to keep in mind that we are focused on data in this discussion. I think that's a good place to start. But data in itself is not the only reason why these platforms are exercising dominance. If you look at how much processing power is used to undertake meaningful AI processing nowadays, then only the very largest firms can really be on the cutting edge of that. So computing power is key, and I think access to skills are key as well. So there is a risk here that if we find ways just purely to open up data, if we think data limitations and data sharing is the only game in town here, you could have a situation where the digital platforms are the only ones who have the ability to exploit data sets to their full potential because they have the processing power and they have the people skills to do this. And therefore, by opening up large data sets, all we're doing is exacerbating existing data dominance, because the only people who can exploit new data sets are existing large technology companies. So that's something to have a think about. But to round up, I think this is a fascinating discussion, but it really does feel we're only in the foothills of the interaction between the privacy and data protection world and the competition world. And for me, it is one of the most intellectually interesting areas that is going on in my life right now. And I recognize a few of the names and the attendees, and I've really welcomed our engagement and discussion so far. So I would encourage everybody here to, if they feel inclined, to spend some time looking at these issues, and also to engage with your peers, whether you're an academic, a regulator, or an industry, engage with your peers in the privacy and data protection world. This is something which I think just really does generate from cross-disciplinary discussions, and I would encourage everybody to go out and find their peers and go talk to them and compare notes. So I'll pause there, and Wynne, hopefully we've got some time for questions.
Thank you very much for your discussion. So now it's Q&A time, and we do receive some questions from our audience. First of all, it's from a YouTube viewer, David Stewart. He asks, why is this different to markets where data is not the critical asset? Can't any preemptive entry seizing a monopoly be a self-funding strategy? Okay, so the second question, it's to Daniele. What is considered predatory in zero price platforms, since the price to use their services is already priced at zero? Okay, and then the third question, I believe, is more for Simon. This audience asks, the economic right over personal data, can ownership be transferred? Okay, so on top of that, I do have some questions for you both as well. So for Daniele, it's a bit technical question. So would it be interesting to consider simultaneous move in your model, given that both firms are dominant in their respective markets? So this should be quite a natural extension to consider, I think. And for Simon, since you are mentioning that there are more cooperation between ICO and CMA, do you see there is a need for reform for competition policy to deal with data? Okay, so we will have around 5 minutes to 10 minutes for discussion because we're ahead of time. So would either maybe Daniele, could you go first?
This is not really about obtaining monopoly in the target market, because in fact what happens is the other firm stays there and all the rents are dissipated in that market. However, as I was mentioning, need not be necessarily about data. This is about assets or conquering conquering a market that provides some assets or some value, in this case data, that are valuable in the primary market. Okay, so it could be data, it could be other forms of such, for instance, the learning by doing kind of thing. By entering the target market, the incumbent learns something that allows it to monetize better in the primary market. So that's about it. So in terms
Daniele,
of,
would you mind turning on your camera, please?
Okay.
We can't see you. Yes, thanks very much.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, and on the other question, what is considered predatory? I think, so first of all, this predation technique might in fact be relevant also in markets that are non-platform. For instance, when you think about Fitbit and the data that can be collected there, or dating, for instance, where the price is not necessarily zero. But anyway, the idea is here to invest enough or having resources to outcompete the competitor, either in terms of price or in terms of quality of services, essentially, in a world where both firms are more or less similar in terms of the ability to spend in order to create value. And so as per your question, yes, it would be interesting to, and I think we did look at what would happen in a symmetric situation. I think you would still have this asymmetric equilibria, but you would have also different equilibria where, for instance, the other firm enters straight away. And yeah, so probably the most interesting one would be the mixed equilibria. But I cannot tell you more about that right now.
Yes, and thanks for the questions. I think this question around what actually data is a fascinating one. It's not one which we've really worked out yet. I am always very cautious of notions of data as property. I think it's a very useful concept, but it's not a definitive answer. A long time ago, I was a chartered accountant for my sins, and I think I think questions around whether we can value data, I think probably yes, we manage to value many intangible assets in the accounting world. There's plenty of methodologies for doing that, and clearly there is value in the data, and some of the firms that have done well over the last few years have done well by valuing data better than other people. But I think it's that oversimplifies the challenge. I mean, a couple of different challenges with this. For starters, it's not a straight question of data being assigned to individuals. My DNA, my health data is very relevant to me. It's also relevant, at the very least, to my children, and in some ways to other members of my family. So who data actually belongs to, who it pertains to, is challenging. Another example there, I guess, is contact tracing during the COVID crisis is a very live area for discussion, but my location and my proximity to others is data that relates to me, but is also very, very relevant to other people. So who it belongs to is challenging, and if you can't work out who it belongs to, then how it can be transferred is challenging. The other issue I have with data ownership as a concept is who's actually going to be transferring their data. And it's a very real world point, but if we actually try to strictly assign data to individuals, then it will be people who are less informed or less well off who'd be more likely to sell away their rights to that data. And what you end up with is privacy as a luxury product, where the rich will be able to maintain their privacy and the poor will not. Now, we are already partly down that route anyway. I'm lucky enough to own an iPhone. In general, and Apple has better privacy protections than Android phones. But iPhones also cost a lot more. And so, are we starting to see privacy as a luxury product already? Discuss. But so for those reasons, I think, data ownership is an interesting concept, but it can't be a one-dimensional discussion. There was also the question, Wynne, that you had around reform competition policy. That's something I think I think reform of all regulation in this area has to be something that all regulators have an open mind to, because our worlds are changing very rapidly, and we have to be open-minded and responsive and non-defensive to what is going on, especially in the UK, given that we are about to enter a new phase of a new regulatory environment from January, and there will be more flexibility for government and Parliament to decide to change policies along the way. So we're very open to that, and our approach at the ICO is to make sure that we continue to be engaged in these discussions, and that's something which we're trying to do through engagement with the CMA and Ofcom through the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum, and also through a range of other channels. So yeah, that's something where we have to, I think, be very alive to the fact that the world is going to carry on changing, and regulation is going to have to carry on trying to keep up.
Okay, so thanks very much for both of your responses. So I guess time is running short and we'll have to wrap up now. So in closing, thanks very much to Daniele and Simon for this very interesting discussion on theory and practice on leveraging in data markets.